Okay, so in our last video about the continuous, we said that we use the continuous when we want to say that the activity of the verb is temporary. And I think I pointed out that this word activity here was going to be important. And the reason that it is important has to do with the topic today, which is going to be state verbs. Now, besides thinking about this thing here, the verb being temporary or not, we also are going to need to think about whether the verb describes a state or this word activity. And if it describes a state, we're not going to be able to use the continuous. So what is a state? States are just the way that things are, descriptions. Okay, so the simplest verb that we use for description is just to be. So the sky is blue today. Now notice this is actually a temporary situation. We have the word today in here, so we're describing just this this one day, and also just, there's night every day too. So the sky being blue will always be a temporary situation. But since we are describing just a state and not an activity, now this is not an activity, notice. Nothing is doing anything here, it just is a certain way. And so this is a description, this is a state verb, and we will not use the continuous for this verb. What would be another one? To want. So I want a burger with bacon right now. All right, so again, right now, temporary, wants change all the time, so this would be a temporary situation. But again, this, we don't care. We'll only think about this temporary or not temporary thing if we are using a verb that describes an activity. All right, and wanting something is not an activity. You can think about it like, is it a choice? Does the sky have a choice to be blue? Do you have a choice about whether you want a burger or not? Not really. What would some other verbs be? Need, very similar to want. I need some examples. All right, so don't have a choice here. I just need it or I don't need it. It's just a description. We're just saying somehow the way that things are. Believe is a good example. I believe you. And you should believe me. So again, just a description. If you believe or you don't believe, you kind of don't have a choice. Well, that's a philosophical question. Maybe you can choose to believe. But in any case, it's a description. It's a state that is being described. And so we should use the present simple no matter what. All right. Some more interesting examples maybe are verbs that can go both ways. So think is a good example of this. So one meaning of think is kind of like believe. You just have a certain idea that you think is true, kind of. All right, so I think that well, that city is wonderful. It's just my opinion, kind of. And in this way, it's just a description of a state. It's not an activity. But it can be an activity. You could say, for example, I'm thinking of examples. You do that. You kind of search your mind, you try different thoughts until you find the one that works, and that is an active process. It's a choice. It's an active process. It's being done. All right. There we have some pairs of words that, well, look, let's use look first. Can have different meanings. So one meaning of look is to appear, and that's just the meaning of the verb here is just that it looks a certain way, basically. It just has a certain physical characteristics that cause it to make a certain visual impression on us, okay? So that restaurant looks good. There would be no way to use continuous with this meaning of looks because it's just describing a state. We'll look at another example of look later. So let's keep that in mind. There will be cases where it is possible to use this for use the continuous, for a state, but I'm just going to recommend that you don't do that. But let's wait a minute. All right, so another meaning of look is to move your eyes in some direction in order to see something, or to see something in more detail, to focus our attention visually on something. So I am looking at the painting to try to get the painter's message. So you look closely at it, you keep looking at it, you keep your eyes in that direction, you focus your attention. So this could be both things, but just because these can go both ways, but that's just because the verb has different kinds of meanings. Anytime that we're using a state meaning for the verb, we have to use a simple. We cannot use a continuous. And if we're using the activity meaning and it is temporary, then we should use the continuous for those cases. All right, let's look at a couple more examples of those that can go both ways. So, see is an interesting example because it doesn't go both. Well, it can also go both ways. You could say seeing. It's like it means like dating. So I'm seeing her. That would mean that you are dating this person. That would be an activity. But let's talk about see in a different way. See is just you can see it. It's in your field of vision. And it's just you can see it somehow. Either if you try to look for it, or if it's just there in the direction you're looking, you see it. So I see 3 buildings on the hill. Okay, it's just what is visible to you, and it's just a state of your mind in this case. Okay, but what would you say if you wanted to say that you were actively doing that? Now, look is one example that we talked about already. You could also say watch. All right, so these would be the activities. If it's the activity meaning of look and watch, I think will always be an activity. So I'm watching the game. So it has the same kind of meaning in a way as see, but instead of being a description of a state, it is a description of an activity, something that is actually being done. Okay, here has something similar. We have here, if it's a state, and that should be in the simple, but you can also say listen. If you listen, then you pay attention, especially to sounds, or you put something on that you want to hear, and then that way you also listen. If you put in headphones and press play, then you listen to something. All right, so there are plenty of other examples, but hopefully by now you kind of get the idea that of this difference between states and activities. That's the main thing that we want to understand here, and to remember that if we're describing a state, we should use a simple and not the continuous. But let's look at one thing that might confuse you and think about what to do about that. And that's the thing that we were talking about with look before. So some states, let's say it this way, native speakers sometimes describe states with the continuous. All right, we said that we would have the example of look. So you are looking very beautiful today, for example. Somebody might say this to somebody. All right, now, what is the meaning of this look here? It's a state, actually. You're describing a state of her, but we use the continuous today. And what would the meaning be here? Don't worry about it too much, because I'm just going to recommend that you not do that. But to understand, we're saying that this is a different state than normal, and therefore probably a temporary thing. So, in other words, she looks more beautiful that day than on a normal day. And because it is, like I said, different than normal, then we expect this to be a temporary thing. And the native speaker, a lot of the time, will describe this state with the continuous, and in order to put that meaning in there, that it is a temporary state. Now, the problem with this is that it doesn't always work. I mean, or it usually does not work. So most states cannot be described. So seem, right? To seem. You can never say she is seeming tired. You can never say that. So what's the difference? There's no real clear difference, and there's no real rule that you can draw from this. You have to say seems here. So what can you do about this? Well, luckily, Luckily, you can always use the simple in these situations with state verbs. It's never necessary to use a continuous. All right, so never necessary to use the continuous with a verb describing a state. Now, why do I say this with a verb? Why don't I just say a state verb? Because very few verbs are only state verbs or only activity verbs, as we've seen in a few examples here, or at least a lot of them are not. And so the question is not, are we using this verb and is this a state verb? The question is this verb, the way it's being used, describing a state or describing an activity? I know it's easier to remember, oh, just this verb is a state verb, this verb is an activity verb, but there are very few like that, actually. There are very few that are only ever state verbs. And anyway, for all the rest of the verbs, we'll still use it in the simple if we're talking, if that activity is not a temporary one. So it's not a very useful extinction. It's not very useful to try to put these words in different categories. State verb, this verb equals state verb, this verb equals continuous or activity verb, because most verbs can be both, and activity verbs are used in both ways depending on whether it's a temporary activity or not a temporary activity. So anyway, back to this point, it's never really necessary to use the continuous with a verb describing a state. So a very good solution to this problem for you guys, for learners, is just never use verbs that describe states, or never use the continuous, let's say, with verbs that describe states. All right, and that should basically solve the problem for you. So you just want to think about, well, let's look what we would do with this one. So instead of saying you were looking very beautiful today, you should say you look very beautiful today. Now, for some reason, it is possible to do both, but the best strategy and the best solution for you is to just use a simple whenever it is a state you're describing. And why? Because it's going to be very difficult to see the difference. Now we said this, let's write it too. Very difficult to know the difference between when you can use the continuous with a state verb and it is never necessary to do that. So if it is not necessary and trying to do so will just lead to a lot of mistakes, then the best solution, the best strategy is this here. Just never use a continuous with these verbs that describe states. Okay, so thank you very much.